Welcome, everyone, to the PFF Fantasy Podcast. I'm John Macri, and I am joined, as always, by PFF's lead fantasy analyst, Nate the Great Jahnke. Nate, the offseason is just beginning to heat up here. We had the Combine last week, which you attended. How did you enjoy that?
I enjoyed it. It was my first time on a radio row and that kind of thing. So, especially on the Tuesday, seeing the coaches and GM interviews, getting some nice little nuggets out of that are fantasy relevant. So, have that in an article up on the website. And then just spending time with some of the PFF guys. Also, met a few people, met some of the fantasy pros guys, met Andrew Erickson, who had worked at PFF for a little bit. Finally got to meet him in person. So, it was a fun week.
Nice. Yeah, that does sound like fun. Yeah, that's a cool event. Hopefully one day I can also check it out, but that's
Hopefully, yes.
maybe one day. But yeah, it does sound like fun. It's always fun to watch it on TV and stuff. So I'm sure it's interesting in person as well. But yeah, today we're going to be previewing free agency. We did that last week with the running backs, and obviously free agency starts next week. We've already had some transactions here in the NFL, players getting released and traded and stuff like that. But we're going to really kind of preview the free agent wide receiver class this week. So last week, if you listened to the running back episode, we talked about kind of who the top names were, some of the landing spots with potential for fantasy relevance, and then threw out a few names and designations who we like to see as kind of like new combinations for this coming season. So naturally, we're going to do the same for the wide receiver position. We actually just had probably the biggest name of this year's free agency class, T. Higgins, likely moved off the board with the Bengals applying the franchise tag to him for the second straight season. We also saw Deebo Samuel get traded to the Washington Commanders. So a couple key names, and destinations maybe come off the board a little bit, but we still have a few players of interest to discuss, Nate. But first, I guess I'd like with this recent news, how are you feeling about two guys that we won't go into a ton of detail today about, with these most recent wide receiver transactions, T. Higgins and Deebo Samuel?
First off, Higgins, not surprised that he got the franchise tag. I don't think that necessarily means that he will stay with Cincinnati. I think a lot will depend on the contracts with Jamar Chase as well. A chance he gets traded, so at least Cincinnati would get something back if they do move on from Higgins. So I don't think the story's done there until we start seeing some contracts signed in Cincinnati, because if not, we could see some pretty lengthy holdouts to both of the Bengals' top wide receivers. And then with Samuel, I think it's a pretty interesting landing spot with Washington, a team that I was excited to see them get one wide receiver, could very well see them getting more, but seeing what Cliff Kingsbury did with the Arizona Cardinals when he was the head coach there with both Rondale Moore and Greg Dortch, both guys low average depth of target, doing a lot after the catch. I think Deebo Samuel is a pretty big upgrade to what Kingsbury was trying to do in Arizona. So I think Samuel can be used in some pretty interesting ways there. Will pair pretty nicely with Terry McLaurin. So I think he should continue to be a fantasy starter. I think he's has a pretty high upside if things are going well. Also, a chance that injuries continue to take a toll on him, like we've seen in recent seasons. So I think he will be in just this large group of players that you can talk yourself into him potentially being a top 10 wide receiver, but also a chance that he could fall off. So one of the reasons why you draft several wide receivers in your fantasy leagues.
Yeah, it's interesting, right? Like Debo's always, when healthy, a very, relevant fantasy wide receiver. We saw last year kind of the drop off, but like you said, he dealt with injuries, he missed some time, and that's kind of been the case with him in recent seasons. But when healthy, definitely an asset for fantasy, and in that offense specifically, like you mentioned with Cliff Kingsbury, it'll be interesting to see if he can get kind of that utilization that works to his strengths, right? And getting the ball in his hands, working after the catch, things like that could, keep his fantasy relevancy a little bit longer. Because yeah, we did start to see the drop off last week or last year. And with Washington and Jaden Daniels, I think it could be a lot of fun there. So yeah, interested to see how this shakes out this season. But we got a lot of other names that are still going to go different places here in the 2025 offseason. So we'll talk about kind of players that are going to likely hit the open market next week. Nate, we have them ranked based on your early 2025 ranking. So We'll start at the top with the highest ranked free agent wide receiver in your ranks, newly minted free agent wide receiver, Devontae Adams. We got the news yesterday that the Jets were releasing Adams. I think, talks about his days with the Jets being numbered kind of started as, potential trade candidate, but then only became even more sure when the team informed Aaron Rodgers that he'd be done there as well. So he's now officially released and will be in search of a new team, along with the many other 32-year-old free agent wide receivers that we'll be talking about. So I guess the question, does he just follow Aaron Rodgers wherever he ends up? Does he reunite with Derek Carr in New Orleans? What do you think are the options here for Devontae Adams at this point, Nate?
Definitely a lot of options for Adams. I think it'll be a pretty common trend of the wide receivers we're talking about. As players who peaked at least a couple years ago, posted on Blue Sky while I was doing my prep for this of the 2021 fantasy wide receivers ranked by points per game, and over half of the top 15 are free agents heading into this class. So Adams definitely fits that category. But Adams is at the top of this group because Adams at his best was better than basically all these other wide receivers at their best. So even though he has fallen off a little bit, his PFF grade has declined some, his NGS receiving numbers in terms of his speed has dropped off a little bit as well, but he's still 75.8 receiving grade or overall grade last year, which was still 30th best for wide receivers. He was still top 10 in terms of fantasy points per game because Aaron Rodgers kept feeding him the ball. And like you said, there are a couple scenarios of where he ends up, and I think there's a lot of them where he still ends up with a very high target rate. So that's why he is at the top of the list, is because I think he has the best chance to still have a very high number of targets next year. Like you said, could reunite with Aaron Rodgers, in which case we know Rodgers is going to feed Adams the ball. I believe the betting favorite is for him to actually return to the Green Bay Packers, which he could easily be their number one wide receiver there and have a better quarterback than what he's had the past couple of years as well in Jordan Love. So another place where the team would pass the ball a lot, Adams would have the opportunity to be a number one receiver. So I think a lot of cases Adams could very well be that top guy. I think my only concern is if he, there's also been reports that he would like to go beyond the West Coast. So a team like the 49ers, who have other receiving options, a team like the Chargers is another one where I think Latin Conkey would still be the top target earner on a team that would probably prefer to run the ball. 49ers, another team that likes running the ball. So I think Adams, it'll a little bit depend on where he ends up, but I think there are a lot of scenarios where he is still a top 20 fantasy wide receiver.
Yeah, I agree. I think, just based on his history of high end target earning, like, I mean, especially if he goes somewhere with, where he has a rapport with the quarterback, right? Where it's Aaron Rodgers or Derek Carr, or maybe going back to Green Bay, like you said, like there's always options where, potential where he could be that number one target in the offense still. Again, another guy that, getting older here, 32 years old, saw a little bit of a decline last year as far as his overall grade. But like you said, it's not so far of a drop off that we're overly concerned about him still having an impact for fantasy here. So yeah, this will be one of I think the top name to watch for sure, like you said. But pretty close to that, I think another player that could be very interesting here is Chris Godwin, formerly of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, was on a wide receiver one pace in 2024 before dislocating his ankle in week 7. So, Nate, doesn't seem like there will be a franchise tag for Godwin, which means he'll likely be looking for a new team here in 2025. So, as I mentioned, prior to his injury, like, he was on fire. He was the PPR wide receiver 2 through the first 7 weeks of the season last year, leading the league in receptions. He owned a top 10 receiving grade. He was having a great year. Now, he just turned 29 years old, so he's not like a spring chicken, but he's also, relatively younger compared to some of the other names in this class. But, if he can bounce back, then I think he's also one of the best of the bunch here, and could be a huge addition to a wide receiver needy offense, potentially as a wide receiver one. What do you think?
Oh yeah, I think it is a top two players in this class, and then a pretty big gap between them and everyone else. Big concern for me with Godwin is the injuries. Him coming off the injury this past year, also him having that ACL and MCL tear not all that long ago. And another concern is that even though he is a very talented player, he's never been someone to score a lot of touchdowns. So that's also been a little bit of my concern with Godwin. So his fantasy value throughout his career has largely been tied to volume. And I think being in Tampa Bay recently has helped him because Mike Evans has really been his only primary competition for targets over these past 4 seasons. So the two have been able to coexist very nicely. Only other player that's really earned a lot of targets in Tampa Bay outside of those two in recent years was Rob Gronkowski's last season there. So uh, I think with Godwin, a lot will depend on his landing spot. Could very well see him returning to Tampa Bay. I think the franchise tag thing was largely because Godwin's been tagged a couple of times, so there's been things to prevent teams from taking players too many times and just how much money they would earn that way. So could see him returning there, but could also see him landing on a team where there is more competition for targets than just Mike Evans, in which case Godwin might not have the same volume, which would hurt his fantasy production, but also a chance that he does return to Tampa Bay. And I think that might be the best thing for his fantasy value.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think, obviously the familiarity there, it would be huge, but yeah, we got a couple fun landing spots for Chris Godwin later in the episode that we'll talk about it, just if we're looking for new spots. But there'll be at least a few, and then we'll talk about some of the teams as well that might need a wide receiver. And Chris Godwin, like you said, probably one of the best options in this year's free agent class. But um, next up is another kind of top wide receiver hitting the free agency market who had his season cut short due to injury in 2024. Stephon Diggs is your third highest ranked wide receiver from these impending free agents. Nate, 31 years old, but about as productive of a wide receiver for his career as we'll see in this class outside of guys like Devontae Adams. But he was coming off his sixth straight season with at least 1,000 receiving yards. Would have been pretty close whether he would have made it to seven if healthy in 2024, but still a good wide receiver who can be of service to any team and make an impact for fantasy, Nate.
Yeah, like the big problem is he's 31 years old, will be 32 by the end of the season, and is coming off an ACL injury. So that is a lot of not great news for a wide receiver. And his speed has also declined a little bit over time. I think for me, it'll be really interesting to see what his role is with a new offense because where when we last saw him in Buffalo as a top outside wide receiver, he was among the top 12 or so fantasy wide receivers. Then Buffalo made that mid-season offensive coordinator change, and that's really what triggered Diggs to not be as big of a priority in the offense. The Bills started running the ball more often. They started spreading the ball out to more of their players, so Diggs just wasn't seeing the same targets. And then he goes to Houston, where he ends up being more of a slot receiver, which I don't think is Diggs' strong point. He ended up performing well last year. I just don't think that's where he's at his best. So a chance he still is a slot receiver wherever he ends up, but he has graded better outside even last year. So a chance he returns to being a top outside wide receiver. A number of teams who are in need of a top outside receiver. So I can see the scenario where Diggs goes back to being a top 15 or so player if he's able to fully recover from this injury and is put in a good position to succeed and has a decent enough quarterback. But I could also see a scenario where he's just not the same player after the ACL tear. And most wide receivers at the age of 32 are at a point where they are not very productive in the NFL anymore. That's around the time Julio Jones stopped being as productive. DeAndre Hopkins has been sticking around, but hasn't been as productive. Uh, Adam Thielen is really the only wide receiver who is older than that in the NFL that still had some production last year. So, a really wide range of possible outcomes for Diggs next season.
Yeah, I could easily see this being a case where, he's not necessarily at his best for the entire season. Like if he is able to kind of start the year right away, week one, he's out there. Like I could see it kind of being a little bit of a slower start for the same reasons, like you said, just age and coming off injury and stuff like that. But, the numbers were pretty solid last year as far as comparing him to his final season in Buffalo. Like nothing amazing, but like still a productive wide receiver where maybe in the latter half of next season he could start to make more of an impact as he gets healthy, maybe as he adjusts to a new team as well. So yeah, he'll be interesting, but there's definitely concerns there with some of the injury risk and now age as well. All right, next up, continuing the trend of veteran wide receivers with a ton of production in their NFL careers, Keenan Allen is set to hit the open market as well now, Nate. He was traded from the Chargers to Chicago last offseason, didn't quite work out as he, had one of, if not the worst season of his career. It was is certainly his worst PFF grade for his career. So is there still hope left for Allen? Do you think that he can be a legitimate weekly wide receiver option for fantasy, Nate? What do you think here?
I still think there's at least some hope. He is 32, will be 33 by the start of the season, which isn't great, but it was just as recently as 2023 where he was the wide receiver 8, had 21.5 fantasy points per game. So it wasn't all that long ago where Allen was an excellent fantasy wide receiver. And how much of last year it could have been partially due to changing teams and it not being the best fit for him. I do think he is someone that has slowed down a little bit as well, but we have seen that big plays or those big plays. And last year in Chicago, there were a number of weeks where he was still a top 12 fantasy wide receiver. It was just a very inconsistent season where his peaks were still very good for a wide receiver. It was just there were plenty of games where he barely did anything in those games. So I think he can end up on a team where if you're forced to put him in your fantasy starting lineup, it'll be frustrating because there probably will be those weeks where he doesn't do very much. But I think he is still capable of having those really big weeks where he might be someone who is a better player in best ball and DFS than he is in redraft. But I think he is still capable of helping an NFL team.
Yeah, I agree. I think, like you said, he's going to be 33 at the start of next season. So we're probably not looking for wide receiver one numbers. I think those are probably off the table at this point in career, but he could still be good, right? And still, he's still among, the better route runners in the league, quarterback friendly, one of the better quarterback friendly targets in the league. And somebody that I'd like to see kind of be an option for maybe a young developing quarterback where he can be that reliable target again. I know that's kind of what we got last year with Caleb Williams, but it just didn't mesh with the offense. And there were other legit options there too in DJ Moore and Romo Dunze. Plus, Caleb had his own issues getting the ball out on time. So it doesn't mean that he can't be a reliable, safe weekly option one more time in his career with the right fit. So we'll see what kind of his priorities are, what he's looking for in free agency. But maybe, he doesn't have as much of a choice at this point in his career as well. So could be interesting with Keenan Allen. Okay, more 30-year-olds from this year's free agent class because Amari Cooper is up next after splitting time between Cleveland and Buffalo last season. He ended up with career low numbers in terms of targets, receptions, receiving yards, receiving touchdowns. So, Nate, obviously, we're well into the back nine of Cooper's career, but I guess the question here is, do you think there's still some fantasy starting capability left for him in 2025?
I think it's possible. I think the top couple wide receivers we talked about, at least in the past 2 seasons, had a stretch of time where they were one of the top 15 or so fantasy options. With Cooper, you probably have to go back another year since it wasn't the greatest year in Cleveland the year before that. But I think there's a lot of reasons that could have gone wrong these past 2 years, one with Cleveland and the quarterbacks. And then once he got to Buffalo, he was injured almost immediately and then was playing with injury basically throughout the rest of the season. So it's possible that Cooper can still be one of these great wide receiver options and has just been unlucky these past 2 years. So that's certainly within the realm of play. Like looking at his per play numbers in a number of categories over these past couple of seasons, he looks like a very great wide receiver, but he will be 31 years old by the start of the season. Another player where his speed just hasn't been quite as there as it was earlier in his career. So another player where I think it's certainly possible, but I think these past 2 years will probably make it hard for him to find a landing spot where a team will consider him as a top wide receiver.
Yeah, finished as the PPR wide receiver 58 last year. So yeah, obviously wasn't like a starting fantasy wide receiver last year outside of, a couple rare weeks, but like you said, he's also just the one season removed from being whatever it was PPR wide receiver 16 I think in 2023. And that was with the Browns and there wasn't like another wide receiver there since, David Njoku was basically the next best option. So maybe there's like another receiving core similar to that where Cooper can have value again. But I think, that's kind of the roster that it'll have to be at this point in his career. Like for all the reasons that you said, I'm not overly optimistic about it, but not impossible either. Okay, finally, a wide receiver under 30. Again, Nate Marquise Hollywood Brown is up next. He was a free agent last offseason as well, signed a 1 year deal, but got hurt this season, even before the season even began, really, and didn't get on the field until week 16. Really wasn't able to make much impact at all in 2024. So for the former first round pick, the question will be, and seemingly always has been with him, as he's bounced around a fair bit, from Baltimore to Arizona to Kansas City to now who knows where. Is there a world where, he can become a consistent weekly fantasy starter? Because it's been a pretty long time since that's been the case, essentially 2021, when he finished as like PPR wide receiver 21. So what do you think, Nate? Can Brown at least get back to being a consistent flex option for us in 2025?
I think it's at least possible. Like you said, it's been since 2021 with the Ravens, where he was kind of the deep threat there. And even 2022 with Arizona, his first year there, he had a pretty decent year, was in that kind of wide receiver three range of players. And then I think the year after that, he was kind of playing out of position, playing more of that X receiver role once DeAndre Hopkins was no longer on the team. So I don't think that was great for Brown. So I think switching positions again with Kansas City, we did see some sparks in a couple of games that he was able to play with the team. So that was good to see. I think I'm concerned that he is just going to play a specific role with the team, though. Do some more of those like crossing routes, a couple things out of the slot, and then be more of that deep threat, and not someone who necessarily earns a ton of targets. But he is a player that like you kind of consistently hear some of these top quarterbacks wishing they had Brown on their team. So I think out of all these wide receivers, he might be one that does get to end up on a team with a pretty solid quarterback, whether it's back in Kansas City, where he could get more of an opportunity there, or with some other team with a strong quarterback. So I think there's definitely an scenario where Brown puts up some pretty big numbers this year, better than what we've seen these past 2 years. But I also think it would be hard for him to be consistent enough for you to be happy to have him in your fantasy starting lineup. I think there would also be those frustrating weeks in there too.
Yeah, I tend to agree. We've got a large enough sample size of Marquise Brown throughout his career that we probably know what he is at this point, and there's a world obviously where he could have this kind of surprise season and stuff like that in the right fit. But I think we just kind of wait to see where the landing spot is with him before getting too excited. But yeah, most likely I agree. He's kind of be what he's been at best. Okay, we got another elderly here with DeAndre Hopkins as the next man up. 32 years old. Surprise, another one. He'll be 33 come the start of the season as well. At this point in DeAndre Hopkins' career, I mean, the top 24 potential maybe feels less likely, if we're thinking about him as a starter. Even maybe more top 36 type guy. We've seen some decline here recently, as it would for most athletes at this point in their careers. But for me, at least, Hopkins feels more like the kind of wide receiver that I think is more of a help to whoever his quarterback is, just by like as far as being like a trustworthy option, but not necessarily as valuable for fantasy as a wide receiver by himself, if that makes sense. What do you think here for Hopkins?
Oh yeah, like he'll be 33 by the start of the season. I think out of all the players we talked about so far, he might be the one most likely to just have his career be over at this point. There's a chance that he could retire or just not get enough interest or wait until halfway into the season and then sign with the team who has an injury to a wide receiver. Like all of those are on the table, in which case he's undraftable in fantasy. Hasn't made a Pro Bowl since 2020. He was wide receiver 30 with the Titans, which a lot of that was kind of volume based of him staying relatively healthy that season. We did see a couple of good games more early on once he was traded to Kansas City. There was a week where he had two touchdowns, I think multiple weeks with 90 or so receiving yards. So there was some spark still in Kansas City, which is why he's on this list at all. But down the stretch, like the last 4 games he played, including those playoff games, caught 5 passes for 36 yards. So really did not do anything when Kansas City needed him the most. So I'm not sure, like, even this part of the season where he was a rotational player the entire year, if that was too many games for him. So I think just because we saw some of those good games late in the year, there's still at least a chance, but I would not say that it's a likely chance that he is fantasy relevant this year.
No, I agree. It just feels very unlikely at this point. It would not be a surprise at all to kind of see him kind of fade to the background here and really just be, more of an NFL asset, especially compared to being a fantasy asset. But um okay, one more name and then we'll group together a few other guys here. But Deontay Johnson, maybe he could be grouped in with this next group as well. It's up to you. But kind of bounced around a lot last season. He went from Carolina to Houston to Baltimore. He never really made an impact anywhere, and he's slowly trailed off as far as production goes over the past few years as well. So he's obviously ranked lower here for you, Nate. Any hope for Deontay Johnson? He's somebody that's at least younger than 30.
He is younger than 30. He did bounce around a lot last year. The Ravens getting him right at the end of the season for a potential compensatory draft pick. Smart move by the Ravens, but Johnson, like, he also had that down year in 2023, but go back 2022, 2021, he did have some fairly nice fantasy seasons there. And that's kind of been the trend of almost all of the guys we've talked about is they didn't do quite as much as we would have hoped last year. And they did maybe a little bit more the year before, but they were very good fantasy options 2, 3 years ago. And Johnson fits that. And he is younger than almost all of the wide receivers we talked about. It just going from 4 different teams over the course of a calendar year and each team deciding to move on from you is really not a great sign. So, a chance that whatever is happening, he is able to turn things around, in which case he can be a fantasy option again. But there's also a chance that after going through all those teams, that no one does want to take a chance on him next year.
Yeah, I mean, look, it's kind of the case with every single wide receiver in this class, or at least that we talked about. Like, none of these guys really did anything to kind of improve their stock heading into free agency, whether it was due to age or just trailing off in production or injury or whatever. But Deontay Johnson's, I mean, yeah, the red flags are all over the place at this point. It's just really concerning as far as him not being able to stick with a team, and then even landing on teams where he could be useful and just not being able to even crack the lineup or make any kind of impact was definitely a concern here. So we'll see, if that changes this season or not. But again, another one that kind of feels unlikely at this point. So just wrapping up with a few bonus names here, I guess, Nate, other guys that made your list here close to your top 200 for early 2025. We got Josh Palmer, formerly of the Chargers, Noah Brown of the Washington Commanders, De'Ami Brown, also with the Commanders last year, Mike Williams, who played with the Steelers last year, as well as the Jets and the Chargers before that. You also mentioned who else did you?
Darius
Darius
Slayton.
Slayton. That was it. Yeah, Darius Slayton was another name. So anybody here really of interest for you, or are these just kind of role player guys that maybe don't make as much impact for fantasy?
Yeah, like I think Palmer is probably the biggest name out of the group, and the reason why he's lower than everyone else is because he has been so remarkably average over the course of the past couple seasons. Like, his PFF receiving grade has very consistently been between 66.6 and 68.3, so that is a very solid role player wide receiver. I have those charts in my player profiles where I look at yards per route run in a number of situations and where that looks percentile wise compared to other receivers. And outside of press, where he struggled a little bit, he is very consistently between that like 50th and 65th percentile. So there really isn't any one thing that I'm seeing with Palmer that like stands out that maybe a team can latch onto that and Palmer can do a lot better. He's going to be a role player. He could be a starter. He could be a solid backup for a team. Not someone that I think will put up a ton of fantasy production. There's a small chance that something about the Chargers was holding him back, and he's still young enough that he has time to improve as a player. So there's a chance. But every other player we've talked about, we did see that like 2, 3 years ago, or even 1 year ago, where they were a very fantasy relevant wide receiver, and Palmer just hasn't been there. And Darius Slayton's another one where like he has very consistently gotten around 750 receiving yards each season in the seasons that he's stayed healthy. So that's around 45 receiving yards per game, which isn't great for most fantasy leagues. And that's probably the ceiling of where he's at. a team will probably pay him money because they don't want an older wide receiver and want to try someone younger, in which case there are very few options. But even if he is a starter for a team that needs a wide receiver, I don't see him being that much better than what we've seen with the Giants.
Yeah, I think that's fair. And yeah, yeah, coming back to Palmer, like I do like him, but like you said, I think yeah, you kind of nailed the description, but kind of had on remarkably average. I think that today's youth refers that as mid, which is not a bad thing. It's not a bad player. He's just like you said, he's remarkably average, and the NFL needs average wide receivers too. So there could be a role for him. I like him for fantasy, when he's given an opportunity, but it just hasn't been anything overly exciting, which is kind of the case with a lot of these guys here later on. So those are kind of the top players for this year's free agent wide receiver class. We'll get into some of the top landing spots here in a second. But first, a quick word from our sponsor, Fabric by Gerber Life. The new year is a great time to reevaluate financial goals, not just for yourself, but for your kids. Now is the perfect time to make sure your kids are on a path toward a solid financial future. A kid's investment account from Fabric by Gerber Life is quick and simple to set up and lets you invest in their future now for education, big milestones, and more. Fabric by Gerber Life was designed by parents for parents to make it easy to plan for and manage your family's financial path. With a kid's investment account from Fabric, you can start investing in your child's future today. Kids can't invest when they're minors, but a kid's investment account allows you to invest on their behalf now, giving their investments more time to grow. It's all online, and setting up an account could take you just 5 minutes. Then you can manage your child's account and monitor their investments right from your phone. Funds can be used for nearly anything benefiting your child, from tuition and tutors to music classes, and when they're adults and out on their own, they can use the funds for anything they need. Join the thousands of parents who trust Fabric to help protect their families. Start investing in your child today at meetfabric.com/fantasy. That's meetfabric.com/fantasy. meetfabric.com/fantasy. Portfolios managed by Fort Washington Investment Advisors Inc. Additional services provided by Apex Clearing Corporation. All investing is subject to risk. Learn more at meetfabric.com. Okay, let's take a look at some of the teams who may be in the market for a wide receiver in free agency, in the draft, I'm sure as well. But for the sake of this episode, let's focus on free agency. And we'll start with the first group of teams, Nate, who you've identified as teams with multiple starters and key backups heading to free agency. So we've got Buffalo, Kansas City, Tennessee, Washington, and Tampa Bay. So, Nate, five teams here whose wide receiver core will likely look much different from last season. Any of these teams that you're particularly interested in or keeping an eye on heading into next week?
Almost all of them, because you have Kansas City and Buffalo, who have two of the best quarterbacks in the league. Even though we know they're going to keep some of their receiving options, but Kansas City, it's Hopkins, Brown, Juju Smith-Schuster, Justin Watson, all heading to free agency. So four of their top six wide receivers. With Buffalo, it's Amari Cooper and Matt Collins, which are two of their three top outside wide receivers. So definitely some opportunities for a wide receiver to go to one of those teams and step up. Washington, I know, added Debo Samuel, but they are also have Noah Brown, Diami Brown, Zacchaeus, Jamison Crowder, all heading to free agency. So there is still room for another starter in Washington to go with that offense. So that could be pretty exciting. And even Tampa Bay, with how pass happy their offense is, if they do end up losing Chris Godwin, and even Mike Evans is getting up there in age, so there is an opportunity for another player to earn a lot of targets in a very pass-heavy offense. So lots of situations, and then there's Tennessee, who we don't know who the quarterback is, and probably isn't as exciting, but there's definitely room for someone to earn some targets there.
Yeah, Tennessee losing Nick 9 touchdowns, Akine. Yeah, you got DeAndre Hopkins, who obviously played a role there in the early part of the season, and then Tyler Boyd as well. Like there's these teams are all losing guys that were contributors last season. Obviously, Kansas City, like you laid out, and Washington losing the most bodies, but there's obviously room here for somebody to kind of step in. It's like we've been kind of saying with the names that are attached to this free agent class. Nobody's like overly exciting or a guaranteed star or anything. Like Devonte Adams is the best of the group, and he's in the back half of his career. So there's potential here, but I think yeah, I'm with you. I think these are probably the best landing spots for any of these guys to kind of step in and make the biggest impact. But not impossible to do with some of these other teams as well, Nate, because this next group is teams with bottom five receiving grades for their wide receiver core in 2024. So could potentially be looking at an upgrade to avoid that happening again in 2025. We're looking at the Arizona Cardinals, Cleveland Browns, Las Vegas Raiders, New England Patriots, and New Orleans Saints. So, Nate, do you have kind of a preferred destination, I guess, for like a starting quality fantasy wide receiver for this bunch?
I think Arizona potentially because they have Marvin Harrison Jr., of course, and then Trey McBride. But I do think there can be a third option. Michael Wilson is a fine enough starter, but it doesn't seem like he's going to be this huge fantasy relevant player. So I think there is room for a wide receiver there. And just because of the quarterback situations, the Patriots are probably the other one. If there is a good enough wide receiver, I think with Drake May at quarterback, May showed enough as a rookie despite the players around him that I think there can be a pretty exciting X receiver there. Probably more excited about a rookie ending up there than a free agent. But again, like a lot of these players, because they are at the end of their career, I more envision them landing on more of these teams with a winning record because they're trying to win a Super Bowl at the end of their career. So I'm not sure how many of these wide receivers would want to go to New England that were at the top of the list of the players we talked about. But I think if a wide receiver likes Drake May enough and wants to play with him, I think there's a huge opportunity there. I just don't think it'll happen with the free agent class.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I mean, these teams they're all losing wide receivers in free agency as well. Arizona, like you mentioned, Greg Dortch, Zay Jones, Zach Pascal, those guys are gone. Cleveland losing Elijah Moore, Jalen Darden, James Prochet, not huge contributors. Elijah Moore was, but Amari Cooper obviously is gone from there as well. But yeah, New Orleans too, kind of interesting only because of the Devonte Adams and Derek Carr thing. They kind of need somebody else there next to Chris Olave. Like I wouldn't be surprised if he's an option for them. I know Rashid Shaheed obviously had the injury last year, but was pretty good when he was in there. But he might need some time to recover as well. So, a 1 year deal for somebody like Devonte Adams could make sense. But yeah, New England definitely could be in a major need here for a true wide receiver one. Probably somebody that they look to draft, I think as well. But it's always an option for a secondary option here in free agency for them as well. All right. Lastly, a couple teams that have or might move on from a starting wide receiver by choice this offseason. We already saw the Jets release Devonte Adams, so they'll be in the market for maybe a wide receiver two next to Garrett Wilson again. And then the Rams seem poised to move on from Cooper Cup at some point this offseason as well. So two high-end target earners in the league not only might be hitting the market, but leaving pretty big holes in their respective offenses. So what do you think the Rams and Jets will be looking to do here this offseason, Nate?
Yeah, I think both teams definitely in need with the Jets. Alan Lazard has also been given permission to seek a trade, even though I think there is a chance that he could return to the team. And then the Rams with Cooper Cup, they also have guys like Tutu Atwell heading to free agency, Demarcus Robinson, Tyler Johnson. So the Rams definitely will need at least one more wide receiver because it's just Puka Nakua and Jordan Whittington. So they will need a third with how much they run 11 personnel. So huge opportunity there, especially with Matthew Stafford returning at quarterback. And the Jets, they really do not have much depth outside of Garrett Wilson. So I think they both need to probably both in the draft and free agency look towards wide receivers. It just depends on how much they want to invest in them compared to other players on the team.
Yeah, there's going to be some huge holes there for sure for both of these teams. I mean, the Rams specifically, like you said, losing Demarcus Robinson, Tutu Atwell, Tyler Johnson, even to an extent, like these guys all contributed for them for the Rams last offseason. And then moving on from Cooper Cup as well, like it's literally Puka Nakua and not a whole lot else. So there's got to be somebody else that comes in there for the Rams. Maybe it is one of these veteran free agent wide receivers. Maybe it is like a Devonte Adams or somebody like that can handle a ton of targets for Matthew Stafford alongside Puka Nakua. But will be interesting to kind of see how they go about it, and if they're able to trade Cooper Cup or if they end up having to release him, we'll have to find out here. But yeah, those are some of the kind of top landing spots. So like we did last week with the running backs, Nate, we kind of picked out three of our favorite hypothetical new landing spots for this free agent wide receiver class. So, these are guys that we just picked out that might have a good fit for the team, still have some fantasy relevance as well. So, let's start with yours. You went with Chris Godwin to the Arizona Cardinals. What do you like about this pick?
Yeah. So with the Cardinals, they really had a kind of hole with their slot receiver last year. They started with Greg Dortch, but as the season went on, he was getting less and less playing time. They tried to like mix in guys in the slot a little bit more often. Michael Wilson became probably their primary slot receiver by the end of the year. But even then, like Wilson has graded better as an outside receiver compared to the slot. So I think Godwin is someone who could be their Z receiver in base and then slot receiver and three wide receiver sets like he's been doing in Tampa Bay for years, in which case he would pair with Marvin Harrison Jr. in base packages, and then Godwin would go to the slot. Wilson would still be part of the offense as an outside receiver in three receiver sets. So I think this passing offense can put up a lot of big numbers. I think having Godwin on the field could also help Marvin Harrison Jr. because defenses would have more players that they need to focus on, where this past year was just Harrison and McBride. So I think he could be a really big help for the offense and still maintain a pretty good amount of fantasy relevance in Arizona.
Yeah, that could be a fun one. Yeah, I'm looking at this picture here. It doesn't look anything like Chris Godwin, I don't think, anyways. But don't blame me. Blame that Gronk or whatever, or Grok, whatever it's called on Twitter there. But uh, yeah, I like the landing spot for the reasons like you said. I worry, like I guess, a little bit about how much it takes away from like Marvin Harrison Jr. and Trey McBride's potential, but it certainly helps Kyler Murray quite a bit as well. Like I just don't know that. Yeah, maybe I want like another high end target earner there in Arizona. Selfishly, just as someone who wants Trey McBride and Marvin Harrison Jr. to dominate the targets next season. I have high hopes for those guys, but I also have a landing spot for Chris Godwin, and I went with the Carolina Panthers. Now, to be clear, Nate, as you pointed out, I still love Jalen Coker. I think he can be reliable and consistent starter in the league, though probably more as like a wide receiver too, at best, if we're being perfectly honest. Carolina still needs that wide receiver one quality player with the potential, I think, to command weekly targets for that offense because they're now like in an interesting spot, right, where they should feel much better about building around Bryce Young as their former first overall pick after he was benched earlier last season, but he bounced back and he kind of flashed that franchise quarterback potential for a guy in year two in the back half of the season. So I like that Young's passing grade improved, the big time throw rate greatly improved. So I think he still needs some maybe help around him because that completion rate, the yards per pass attempt, while it did improve, it was still only about average for the position. So I think you add in a viable number one receiving threat like a Chris Godwin to the mix for Bryce Young will potentially put that high end passing ability to much better use and allow both players to kind of prop each other up a little bit. So Godwin, to me, I mean, you look at the roster, he would be the clear lead target, and Young would have like a consistent receiving threat who can succeed at different levels of the field to rely on as long as he's healthy. But again, they have these young guys, Jalen Coker, Xavier Legette, but I'm not sold on Legette being able to move into a consistent wide receiver one role for this team in 2025, maybe a little bit longer. And the Panthers have shown some hesitance in fully embracing Coker as a full time starter as well. So you could kind of avoid having to promote both of those guys immediately and at least until you're ready or until they're ready by bringing in like an established weapon like a Chris Godwin. So I went with Carolina for Godwin.
Yeah, I think Carolina is interesting. Like the teams that we were going through, a lot of them had like multiple holes potentially at wide receiver, so potential to add two or three guys. But there's still like a good dozen plus teams that are potentially losing one wide receiver, and then even beyond it, as teams like Carolina, I think Green Bay kind of fits that category as well. Of like you can pencil in who the three starters are next year, and it's okay enough on paper, but even with having three players you can pencil in as starters, there's still room to upgrade. So Carolina, I think, is one of those teams. I think I personally would probably prefer Carolina to add more help on the outside so that Coker can play more in the slot rather than adding another slot receiver and forcing Coker outside and probably like I'm assuming in this scenario they'd probably release or trade Adam Thielen because I'm not sure how Thielen and Godwin would coexist. But Godwin definitely would be an upgrade to any of those three wide receivers, though, and help the offense in general. So I think Carolina fits. I think basically almost any team could probably make Godwin fit on the roster.
Yeah, I think so. And yeah, I should have mentioned in my scenario, yeah, Adam Thielen is not as much of a factor at all a factor here for Carolina in 2025. But yeah, I think looking at Godwin too, like if we're looking to make him and Jalen Coker coexist too, like Godwin does, he can be effective on the outside as well. He's more effective in the slot, but I think there's potential to kind of move him around a little bit. He has that kind of versatility, and I know Carolina, wide receiver, that position group as a whole isn't necessarily a need, but I think that just that lead wide receiver position is probably more of a need for them, if that makes sense. So,
Hmm.
um, all right, let's go with your next pick here, Nate. Amari Cooper reunited with the Las Vegas Raiders was one that you liked here. What do you like about this?
Yeah, so the Raiders in need of an outside receiver. They aren't really losing anyone this year, but Trey Tucker, DJ Turner were two of the three top wide receivers on the team after Devontae Adams stopped playing. Both were under zero point 0.8 yards per route run. And so Jacoby Myers kind of had to do a little bit more on the outside when he does play a little bit better in the slot. So ideally, the Raiders can add more of an outside receiver so Myers can do more of his thing there. And we were talking about before with Cooper, like he needs to be on a team where he is able to earn a lot of targets. And even though Brock Bowers is there to get a ton of targets on the inside, Cooper would be the clear top outside option for the Raiders. So I think the Raiders are one of these landing spots where even if it's not Cooper reuniting with the team, I think that's a situation where a guy like Stephon Diggs could end up getting a ton of targets. DeAndre Hopkins could go there and still find some relevancy because they just don't have those outside receiving options. So I think Cooper makes a lot of sense there. He started his career there, so it could be nice for him to end his career there. But he's the one that I like to the Raiders.
Nice. Yeah, and a nice thing I didn't have to rely on Gronk there to make the image of Murray Cooper as a Raider. But yeah, I mean I like it because yeah, it's a need for them at the position, but like also not a massive threat to Brock Bowers, who is by far the most important fantasy asset on that team. We need him to kind of continue being the focal point and thriving for us. And I think someone like Cooper coming in still allows that to happen and gives them another option as well. Like you said, on the outside. So could be fun there. So my next one, I went with Stefan Diggs to the Kansas City Chiefs. Now, this one, I like to think of the image of Diggs watching the Chiefs celebrating beating his Buffalo Bills in the 2022 AFC Championship game, and picture that as kind of like the catalyst for this. Like, if you can't beat them, join them, because this could be like a signing that I think helps both sides. So, if you look at the Chiefs pending free agents right now, they might lose Justin Watson, Juju Smith Schuster, Marquise Brown, Mecole Hardman, DeAndre Hopkins to free agency. That accounts for 52% of the team's wide receiver targets from this past regular season, which is the most of any team. Then you add in that potential Rashi Rice suspension as well. Like there's plenty of reason to believe that the Chiefs could utilize Diggs's services. And like we've been saying, he did drop off last year. Like slightly even before the injury, but he wasn't washed either, right? Like he's coming off this season ending ACL injury. He's on the back nine of his NFL career, but he's also not a player that Kansas City will necessarily need for like the entire season. If they want to ease him in coming off injury, I think this is a guy that they can take their time with, allow him to heal up and get back to full speed or whatever speed he can muster at 31 coming off a knee injury, and hope that he can kind of make an impact in the latter half of the season. He was again still performing well for the Texans prior to his injury in that offense, and I think he should allow for somebody like Patrick Mahomes and Stephon Diggs as well to kind of benefit from one another's play. Where, yeah, maybe in the latter half of the year he could be that consistent fantasy starter, maybe a flex option once he's kind of implemented in that offense.
Yeah, I think whatever wide receiver Kansas City adds or brings back, because I could very well see them also trying to bring back Hollywood Brown and or DeAndre Hopkins instead. But if they want to upgrade Diggs, I think is a very interesting option on the team. I think with how much the other wide receivers do play in the slot and Travis Kelsey also being an inside option, that should give Diggs an opportunity to play more on the outside, like we saw in his peaks with Buffalo and even going further back with Minnesota. So I think Kansas City is a landing spot where Diggs has a pretty decent potential to return to being that fantasy player he once was. And even if he's not working out at wide receiver, based on the jersey number he has there, which looks like a 30 and a half of a seven, maybe he can play safety if wide receiver isn't working out for Kansas City.
Yeah, no, I noticed that as well. Grok not able to figure out numbers, I guess, but they did get him celebrating like an AFC Championship win. I guess kind of okay. So, but yeah, that jersey number is a disaster. I don't know what that is. But speaking of the Kansas City Chiefs, we mentioned them potentially losing Hollywood Brown this offseason. So, what's the next landing spot you have for Marquise Hollywood Brown here in 2025, Nate?
I have him with Washington. I think with Terry McLaurin being such a good contested catch player, and then what Debo Samuel can do on those shorter passes, having someone like Brown who can stretch the field, he can both play in the slot and outside. Something Debo Samuel can do, so they can move the players around the formation. Washington also last year liked to have a lot of plays with two running backs on the field, and having Brown potentially line up in the backfield or Samuel line up in the backfield. There's a lot of fun things that they could do with the formation that way. Someone who's also good at like crossing routes, those kind of things. So I think he would add a fun element to the offense that isn't necessarily fully there with Samuel and Terry McLaurin. So I think it would just be a really fun fit. How much it would be beneficial for fantasy football with how much Washington will probably be running the ball and still throwing to Terry McLaurin a lot. Maybe not the best spot for his fantasy production, but I think just a really fun fit for how he can help another team's offense.
For sure, and has some familiarity, right, with Cliff Kingsbury's
Oh,
offense, I
yes.
believe, right? So, could be, yeah,
Yep.
somebody that they're looking at if yeah, they want to just add some more weapons for Jaden Daniels, which I think is the main thing, right? Like he only really had Terry McLaurin last year. He had Zach Ertz as well, but like
Yep.
a mid 30s Ertz doesn't provide the same threat as adding in a Debo Samuel and a Hollywood Brown to the offense. So, would definitely love that for Jaden Daniels. I like we've been saying, I don't think Browns would be anything more for fantasy than he's already been in his career. I think this would kind of limit his ceiling considering the other options, but I don't think he really had that high of a ceiling anyway. So I like this spot. But yeah, anything to help Jaden Daniels avoid a sophomore slump, I will 100% get on board with because I really want him to continue to crush it in the NFL and for fantasy. So last name here that
I'll add
yeah,
though,
go ahead.
in Kingsbury's offense, he was averaging 13 points per game, and you did miss out on an opportunity. Washington had two other wide receivers named Brown. You could have just gotten the backfield with Jersey with Brown there, and that could have worked out. So Washington's already gone through multiple players named Brown. They can go for another one.
That's a good point. Yeah. Any Washington Commanders fans that may have had a De'Ami Brown or a Noah Brown jersey could potentially get away with just keeping it and hoping that Marquise Brown maybe keeps the same number. But okay, so one more ideal landing spot here for me. I went with Keenan Allen to the Tennessee Titans. So this one actually looks like Keenan Allen. So that was good. The
Good.
Titans they're in a position here to draft a quarterback with the first overall pick. If they so choose, they could always go a different direction, either trade or whatever. But for the sake of this point, let's say they go QB at number one and now have this young rookie quarterback who will need kind of a trustworthy, established wide receiver to rely on consistently. And I know they have Calvin Ridley, but to me, he's been anything but consistent over the past few years. So someone like Keenan Allen, who is still among the better route runners, separators, QB friendly targets in the league, like I said before, I think there's value in bringing in a guy like that for a young rookie quarterback. And if they really click, then yeah, there could be fantasy value for both players as well. Um, but I think if the Titans are interested in kind of making life easier for their rookie quarterback, assuming that they draft one. I think someone like Keenan Allen makes sense for them. Although for him, who probably wants to go somewhere where he has a chance to win. I'm sure it's not ideal, but everyone wants to win, and I don't necessarily know that he's at a point in his career where you know uh, he's necessarily like a contender considers him a must add on their roster. So beggars might not be able to be choosers here, basically what I'm saying. So we'll see what happens with Keenan Allen's market. But I kind of like the idea of, whoever the Titans draft at number one, if it is a quarterback, having somebody like Keenan Allen that they can tie him to. I know, again, we saw that with Caleb Williams last year, but Caleb Williams had his own issues and there were other options on that team. So what do you think? Keenan Allen to Tennessee?
Yeah, I think it would give him an opportunity to be that very clear number two option. We have seen in his this offense, the slot receiver have some prominence in the past. It was with Tyler Boyd, and Boyd was the slot receiver last year, and he managed 390 receiving yards over 16 games, so and no touchdowns. So really wasn't a lot of production from the slot last year. So I think Allen could be a pretty significant upgrade there, and then also someone on a team that does a decent amount of two tight end sets and that kind of stuff. Allen can still play on the outside in those formations as well. So form a nice duo with Ridley. So I think that would work just fine. I do have an article up on the website now going over basically free agency in total with the running backs, wide receivers, quarterbacks, tight ends, even talked kickers a little bit in there, and had landing spots for everyone. I put Allen on the Ravens, which would not be great for his fantasy production. This would probably be a better option for his fantasy production. But in terms of the thought process of Allen trying to chase a ring at this point in his career, the Ravens certainly don't need Allen, but Allen can help the offense add another element and potentially get Allen a little bit closer to winning a Super Bowl.
Nice. Love it. All right, that is a wrap for us this week. Thank you all for tuning in, and if you please be so kind to like, subscribe on YouTube, or leave a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. It helps us a ton, and we'd greatly appreciate it. Nate, thanks as always for doing this with me. Please let everybody know what you have going on at pff.com this week.
Yeah, so have mentioned the two most recent articles already, but the big free agent preview went up today, going over each position. And then last week, when I was at the combine, went over the top takeaways that I had from the press conferences there. So have that all up on the website. Next week is free agency. So we'll have free agent rankings to start the week and then kind of reactions as the week goes on. It'll be pretty interesting to see how active free agency early on compared to later, since while we went through running backs and wide receivers, there's still plenty of rookie options. So I'm not sure how hesitant teams might be. I think quarterbacks might end up being the most interesting position early on in free agency, but just depending on how that goes, we'll have some winners and loser articles, and then we'll be on the podcast. If things get really busy, maybe we'll put out another episode or two. And if things are quiet, then we'll stick with our usual schedule. But hopefully, we have an interesting free agency to pick up the year.
Yeah, always more fun with a lot more activity here in the early part of the off season. So as for me, I'm wrapping up the stable metric series this week for like incoming rookies at each position, taking a look at how they all stack up using PFF's key stable metrics. I've done quarterback, wide receiver, running back, tight end, edge defenders, defensive tackles, and then linebackers and safety are still to come this week as well. If you want to kind of get to know this year's incoming rookies a little bit from kind of our stable metric standpoint, you can check that out. And like Nate said, we'll be back next week recapping early free agent moves. I'll be doing the same for IDP with the guys from the IDP show here in the channel. So be on the lookout for both of those. And until next time, peace out.